Today's guest on the podcast is Katie Arnold. Katie is the author of the new book, Running Home, but she's also a ultra running champion. She won the 2018 Leadville Championship trail race. I don't know if it's called championship. I probably just made some noob, ultra running, wrong name. Leadville. Anyone in the running community knows Leadville. Okay. She won, top female in Leadville, and 11th overall out of all the people. So pretty incredible story. I can't wait for you guys to hear it. I love the message about taking care of yourself and finding that outlet that allows you to be a better human, a better employee, wife, mother, whatever your labels are, and how finding movement and finding that ability to be in your body is really a key to achieving what you desire. So I hope you all enjoy this episode with Katie Arnold.
Welcome to the Same 24 Hours podcast with Meredith Atwood. We all have the same 24 hours each day, and it's what we do with those hours that makes all the difference between our health, happiness, and success.
Everybody, welcome to another episode of the Same 24 Hours podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Atwood. I'm super excited about today's guest. Katie Arnold is here. Hi, Katie.
Hi, how are you, Meredith?
I'm good. I'm just hoping the lawnmowers don't come today. They know when it's podcast day and they like to mow the lawn. So.
I've got motorboats in the background.
Oh, so motorboats. Perfect. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited to talk to you about all the things, and especially your new book, Running Home, which we were talking about before we got on. We are book neighbors in several bookstores across the country, right next to each other on the shelves.
Great.
Little twinsy books. So let's talk a little bit about your childhood and your kind of what made you want to write this book.
Yeah. So Running Home really was born out of losing my father. This was, I guess, going on 9 years ago. In 2010, shortly after my second daughter was born, my dad was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and he started declining really rapidly. Like as fast as my baby was growing, my father was dying. And if you have kids, or if any of our listeners have kids or have gone through grief, those are two really intense experiences, having a new baby and being in that grief kind of bubble, as I describe it in Running Home. And it was just a tumultuous, very emotional time. And the way my grief manifested after losing my father was it came out as anxiety, so that I was afraid I was dying too.
Oh, wow.
And it was, I hadn't experienced anxiety like that. And I think it's, now that I've gone through it, I understand that it's not uncommon. And it also is tied into being a mother, which I write a lot about in Running Home, is mortality, right? Like you can get away with thinking you're not mortal like everyone else while you're young. And I think that's what youth is. You're just kind of going about your business, not believing that it's going to happen to you. But then when you have a child, suddenly, right, it's like this big wake up call, and life seems so much more precious. And so combine that with losing, a very close parent. It was a pretty turbulent time. And so I tried lots of different things to ease my anxiety. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Well, I'm not there right now, but that's where I live. And there's lots of alternative healers. And I, over the course of about 18 months, I probably tried, all of them. And some of the healing methods worked, helped with the anxiety, but others didn't. And but the thing that really did work the best was running. Yeah. And running long distances and into the wilderness. So I've always been, a big lover of nature and mountains and trails. And so I'm not your typical road runner. So it wasn't just going out and pounding the pavement. It was really moving on my own 2 feet through the backcountry and through the mountains. We have some really rugged, remote backcountry right out our door in Santa Fe, mountains that go up to 12,500 feet. And I was just running alone through the woods. And that's, where I felt the most relief from this anxiety. It's sort of counterintuitive because I was so afraid of dying and leaving my
Right.
children.
And you're in the woods alone.
I'm going out every day, like deep into the backcountry where there's animals and, hazards and weather. But so it didn't make sense on one level, but then it did completely make sense. And this, just looping back to your question about my childhood, I've always been a runner. And
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, running has always been this very private, personal thing for me. I didn't compete as a child. I wasn't on track or cross country, but I always ran. And I started running when I was 7, just on a lark, like on the suggestion of my father. He's like, hey, do you want to run this 10K race? It was near his farm in Virginia where he lived. And my dad was not a runner. I love this part of the story because my dad wasn't a runner and he didn't have aspirations for me to become a runner, right? It was the 70s. It was before parents, But
you had the cool headbands, right?
I had headbands. Yeah, but it was before parents really kind of like thrust their own ambitions on their children like we do now. So my dad just suggested it. And because my parents were separated and I didn't get to see my dad very much, also another thing that's different now, right? Like divorce, we lived 4 states away, and we only saw my dad a few times a year. And when he suggested something, it was like, let's do it. This is time with dad. Let's do it. And so I did the race, and my sister and I surely finished dead last, but we did not care. I didn't care. When I crossed the finish,
how old were you? You were
7.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
6 miles for a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Like you have no idea that distance is inconceivable, to be honest. And so when I crossed the finish line, it was like, and I write about this in the first chapter of Running Home, is that feeling of, oh my God, I did it. Like this thing I thought was impossible. And I, straggled my way along and I got it done. And it maybe wasn't pretty, but the lasting feeling that I came away with was like, I'm stronger than I think I am. And there's, sort of a beauty and reward in the struggle. And I think that's really where the seeds of my ultra running and my long distance running were planted as a child. And so anyway, that began my love of running. But I never, except for that race, which I ran every year, I didn't compete. Mm-hmm. Running just got to be this private thing for me. And again, because my parents could have cared less whether I ran or not, they never troubled me with it. So I got to have my own relationship with it, which I think now as a parent, it's so important to let our kids develop their own relationship with things rather than us foisting an agenda on them or ambition or goals. And so running from a very young age was really tied to writing for me. And I wanted to become a writer from about, probably not coincidentally, the same age that I started running. And when I moved my body, and it wasn't in wilderness then, I grew up in suburban New Jersey, but that's a different kind of wilderness, right? Like the suburbs. And, I would just run around the block or ride my bike or shoot hoops. And when I did those physical activities, I would kind of lose myself in the motion and in the movement. And my imagination would sort of respond and kind of loosen with the activity. And I would tap into this storytelling side of myself. So as I moved, I would tell stories. So that's what running has really been for much of my life, was just a way to be a writer and a way to jumpstart my imagination.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I get that feeling too. I come up with the best ideas when I'm moving, when I'm exercising
and you're not trying to, right?
No.
Like you probably are like me. You never set out like, I'm going to go on this run and I'm going to use the run to think of X, Y, and Z. Sometimes I might have that intention, like, I'm stuck on something in my writing and maybe I'll come through it on my run. But it's never like an analytical process. It's just, it is that sort of moving daydream, that really fruitful way that we are when we're not thinking about the thing we should be thinking about, and then when we're free from those thoughts is when we have those breakthroughs.
Yeah.
When we can get our kind of thinking, rational brain out of the picture, we're so much more fluid and creative.
So how did kind of, you ran your whole life, but then with your father's passing and your second child being born, how did that change? Like, how did going into the woods kind of change everything? Because then you became competitive, right?
Right.
Is that when you started competing?
Yes, that's when I started doing. I mean, I had competed maybe a race every, once a year, kind of just in that same model as I had as a child, like kind of just a lark. And I would usually do really well. And I'd be like, I'd have a moment where I'd think, I guess I'm kind of good at this. Maybe I should keep going. But then I would just go back to the way I run, which was just, I ran a lot, but it was just for myself. And so really when I was in that initial, I just call it kind of the triage phase of my grief, when I thought I was dying. And I mean, I would hear something, I could hear like a news report of a rare disease on the, the radio, or read like the first line of a newspaper story. And I would feel like I had that. Mm-hmm. And so that lasted about 18 months. So in that period of time, I was just really running to survive. And when I ran, I could, after a certain amount of time passed while running, I would sort of move beyond those thoughts and that worry. And I would just become embodied, a physical, my body would take over and my thoughts would drop away. And, the brain, the thinking mind can come up with lots of stories, some of which are helpful and some of which are not helpful, but the body usually tells the truth, right? And so my body was telling me I was strong and that I could keep going. Gradually I began to believe that, right? So I began to believe that my body was healthy. And I certainly felt that when I ran, and when I would finish running, the anxieties would come back. So it wasn't that the running totally cured me of it, but it helped me manage it.
But I think this is so important for people to hear, because you had young children and you went out and did what you felt you had to do to survive and to thrive and to try and get past. And so many times women are guilted. For taking time, for doing what they need to do, whether it's going back to work. Like, some women have to go back to work to survive, and some women have to go run, and some people have to lift weights. And that is so underplayed, because I know when my kids are 14 months apart and they were bam, bam. And when my daughter was 6 weeks old, I was like, I have to go back to work or I'm not going to survive.
Right.
Like, that's where I was at that time. Then I later started using exercise and triathlon for that. But women need that sometimes. Right.
And I think culturally we're not always given, the message is not always supportive of that. And that so I feel like there's guilt, external guilt that we may feel.
It's like a vanity thing. People think it's a vanity thing.
Right. People think, or people think it's a, especially with things like running, they love to think it's like an obsession, or rather than like just a very profound and,
kind
like
thing,
effective way, effective piece of self-care. I mean, that word or that phrase is such a buzz right now, but it is. And, it is how I care for myself. It's also how I love myself. I'm always most comfortable in my own skin, and most content with who I am when I'm on the top of a mountain or filthy or tired, I'm pushing past my perceived limits. And so when I can do that and care for myself in that way and love myself in that way, I can love my family better and I can take care of them better. And, but it's still kind of a radical notion. And when I was first running, and my younger daughter Maisie was just a baby, and I was, thought I was dying, and I was going out running, I would just go out, for an hour. I had no plan. But as I, saw that it was helping me to feel better, I started wondering, well, how far could I go? And what am I capable of? And that wasn't sort of like trying to get into races and prove myself with wins or victories, but it was a curiosity about both my physical stamina, but also my emotional stamina, because that's really what ultra distance running or ultra running teaches you, or is how to tolerate uncertainty. because when you're out
Yeah.
for running long distances, say 30 miles or 50 miles or 100 miles, right? There's so many variables that you cannot predict, which is really a metaphor for life. You know, we think we have things under control, and people love to do like, what's your 5-year plan? And where are you going? Where do you see yourself? And, you know, we live with that illusion of control. And some of that's a necessary illusion, right? Because otherwise we might sort of be paralyzed with, you know, fear with what's around the next bend. But, it's just an illusion, because then when you do lose someone, you know, as I had lost my dad pretty rapidly, without a lot of warning, you realize that we don't have control. And so that anything can happen and may happen at any point. And so really, I think my attraction to those ultra distances was just like really learning to tolerate that uncertainty and to not know what was around the next bend or what the weather would bring, but trying to be prepared for it and trying to really teach myself how to weather those literal ups and downs on the trails, and that are so similar to life.
So I never thought of ultra running as preparing for uncertainty. I've thought of it, you know, like training yourself to endure pain and, but uncertainty, that's such a great way to look at it, because that's what we're all scared of.
That's what we're all scared of, is the not knowing. Right. And, you know, that's a big theme kind of in Zen Buddhism, is to like embrace the not knowing. And, there's themes of that in my book, because I meet a friend who's this incredible Zen teacher who kind of comes into my life at this very serendipitous moment, and then becomes in the book. And this was true in life. She's sort of like that Yoda voice. Like she'll just chime in with the exact right thing you need to hear when you need to hear it. But just to the larger point of not knowing, I think it goes against our cultural, like the way our culture is. Like we're expected to know things and predict and get things sorted out and have everything dialed, right?
And spread that to our children.
And spread that to our children.
Them and what they need to do too.
But really the not knowing, if we can embrace it and kind of just open to it, is sort of the most beautiful place to be, because yes, some hard things might come around the next bend, but also some beautiful things and unexpected things and kind of wondrous moments that if you're always planned out and on this certain path forward with your blinders on, you're going to miss those moments. And so really, ultra running and losing my father and becoming a mother, right? They're very similar things, have taught me it's training for how to be in that not knowing, and to just open to it and to kind of even be grateful for it. You know, there were many times even writing this book when I thought I needed to know what was going to happen with the book and how it was going to play out, or what I was going to, you know, how I was going to do the next chapter. I mean, it's great for writing too, you know, this not knowing. And I would try to be, I would fool myself into thinking for a minute that I was going to be the boss of the book.
Right.
And whenever that happened, invariably, and it didn't happen that often because I would catch myself, but when it happened, I would just hit the wall, and I would, you know, you just crash into this wall that you've made for yourself, because I couldn't, you know, I would shut myself, by trying to control the book, I would shut myself down to the flow of the book. And the book, you know, always had its own energy. Right. And my job was just to sort of harness it and ride that energy and let it flow, and not enforce my own will upon it.
Which is really hard, because I know when I gave my book proposal for the new book I've got coming out, you know, they want to know what you're going to write.
They want to know. They want to know.
Chapter by chapter.
Yes.
And I went off for chapters, completely off path. And, you know, I sent it to my editor and I was like, I'm real sorry about this. And she's like, oh no. And then she said, well, just let me read it. And I did. And she's like, keep going, you know, but at that moment, if I had tried to constrain it to what I had originally thought it was supposed to be, it would not be what it is.
Well, and also if you map it all out in advance, and I think there are some writers who do that, and there are also some runners who do that successfully. They map out their training for 2 months in advance or whatever. That's just not my flow, and that's really not how I, you know, am in my highest creative state. But I think sometimes the risk you run when you map it all out is that you will miss those the moments of serendipity, like my friend, the Buddhist, coming into my life. She was just walking down the street one day. She's quite a well-known author herself. She's written 15 books, and probably her best-known book is Writing Down the Bones. Her name's Natalie Goldberg. But so she was just walking down the street, like in her Zen, Buddhist way, like with her hands clasped, very serene. And, I could have easily just buzzed right by or not thought twice, but I was paying enough attention to know that this was a moment that was going to mean something to me. And I didn't know what. I just had this feeling, and I write about it in Running Home, but I had this feeling when I saw her that we would be friends. I had no idea why I had that feeling. I mean, she's a very well-known writer, and lots of people kind of want her time. And but I just saw her and I thought, we'll be friends someday. And sure enough, eventually that came to pass. But I think that's tapping into that intuition that we have inside of us that is so strong, but we forget. We forget how to listen to it. And it can really guide us in the right direction if we slow down and pay attention. But our life is so busy right now, right? And we're relying on these screens, these things external from us, like our devices and our screens, and we're kind of like these automatrons.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We're relying on our autopilot that we've created at some point too. And we don't even know why we created it.
And we lose touch with that inner voice that has that knowing, right? So there's that inner knowing that kind of works in conjunction with the larger not knowing. So it's like you want to be in kind of a balance with the two, like tapping into your voice. I mean, that was really my intuition was like, running feels good, go do it. Even though on the surface, like I was saying, it didn't make a lot of sense. I was afraid. And why go run alone? And put yourself at some exposure to risk by being alone in the mountains. But it was just that voice inside, it was instinct. And I'm glad I listened, because there's lots of reasons. Society saying like, don't leave your children, you're irresponsible, don't go alone, it's dangerous for women. There's lots of voices that I could have listened to. My own voice, you're dying. And I think ultimately that's the message of Running Home, is that we can be in charge of the stories we tell ourselves, and we can make them positive versus, listening to the stories that aren't supportive and aren't conducive to growth. And but it's taken me a long time, like my whole life, to figure that out, that, oh, wait, I can tell the stories that I want to live.
Right. I loved, and Brene Brown, she has that Netflix special. She was talking about where she was having a conversation with her husband, and she had to ask herself, like, what story am I telling right now? Because he did something and she took it one way, and she made up this whole story about it, how she didn't believe he thought she was attractive. And ever since I watched that, I've really thought about sort of my relationship to people in the world, or with my publisher or whatever, when something happens or doesn't. And I'm like, okay, what story am I telling myself right now about what is happening? Right. And we stop and listen. It's kind of freaky. We're really neurotic.
Yeah. And we tell stories all the time, and some of them have zero basis in reality.
Right.
But it's also the storytelling impulse. I'll just flip that story on its head, that like we make trouble for ourselves by telling stories. The flip side of that is that's really our imagination, and our imagination is such a powerful tool, especially like for you and I, who are writers or other artists or creative types out there. Like, it's a beautiful thing. And so, being able to tell stories about ourselves is an indication that we have a healthy imagination. It's just that, like, let's make sure we're telling ourselves the right stories.
Right.
Not the story of like, oh, I'm dying of a rare disease,
right,
when in fact I just ran 30 miles. That's not a productive story.
So let's talk about the competition. I mean, you really have quite a resume, including the win at Leadville last year. I can't even fathom that.
I know.
I mean, 100-mile trail race, you guys. Let's just talk about, I don't want to drive that far.
Actually, driving is harder.
Driving is harder. You're crazy.
Yeah. So, I got through that initial like triage period of running, and I kind of came through it, and I had this, suddenly I was back, and it was like I popped out of that grief bubble I was also inside the baby bubble, right? Like if after you have a baby, you're sort of in that fog for a while and it's sort of beautiful, but also like time moves at a different pace. But then eventually you pop out and you know it. All of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm out. I'm out of the bubble. And so I popped out of both of those like about 18 months after my dad died. And I had this new understanding that I would die too someday, and hopefully not for a very long time. Like the acute anxiety had sort of subsided, but I still knew like, okay, if I'm going to die, like I want to live. And I had this moment where I realized that we were on this river trip. We take our children out into the backcountry a lot, and rivers are really powerful places for me because they sort of symbolize that flow state that we were talking about a little bit earlier, of just being in the flow with and not pushing against or resisting life, but tapping into this larger energy. And so I was on a river, and I'd been terrified to go because we had babies, and who takes their babies on rivers? Well, we do, because we've always done rivers, and we're quite conservative. Anyway, but I had this moment where finally, like the second day on the river, the panic had subsided, and I was just settled for the first time in probably a year and a half. And I had that moment of like, if I'm going to die, I want to live first. And for me, that meant I want to see what I'm capable of as a runner. Like I knew I had talent. I knew that I was naturally good at running, and I had been for a long time. And so it was like, okay, let's really see what we can do. And again, it wasn't about proving myself to anyone, but it was just a curiosity to see what kind of stamina I had. And I was just about 40. I think I was 40 years old, and I had been like nursing her pregnant for 4 years. My baby just weaned herself, and it just seemed again like that voice inside was like, try this now. And so I ran my first ultra marathon, which was a 50 kilometer or 31 miles. And I won that without, that was never the goal. And I went on to increase my distance and was, winning pretty much at each distance. But more than the winning, because the racing and the winning are just like a fraction, like the tiniest part of why I run. It was really developing that inner strength that I had been needing that was helping me weather both the grief and just the insanity of being a mother to 2 young children. We all need that inner strength and that conviction. And as an athlete yourself, like, the feeling you get when you have the confidence you have in your sport totally translates to the rest of your life. And I just found that I had more tools, more stamina, more resilience, more self-compassion and love for myself.
And even it can come when you're not talented, because because you're so very talented.
No, you don't have to have the results at all. I mean, anything. It's just the doing.
Like the confidence in the sport. And I am such an unaccomplished triathlete. So like the confidence came for me, like putting in the promise to myself, showing up, because I was so kind of rotten at all the sports. And so, I think there's that component too, when you're not accomplished, because when people hear, how talented you are, and they're like, well, I can't even run.
Right.
But there's a whole spectrum.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the recurring theme in how I run is that I've never been trying to win. Like
right.
I don't start training so that I can win something. For me, it's really about, as you were just saying, the process of showing every day and making that effort for myself, and by extension for my family, because
exactly.
stronger I am inside, the better I am as a mother and a wife and a writer. And so I think that I've been able to have success because I haven't put in part because I haven't put the emphasis on being successful, right? And so, you mentioned Leadville. That was certainly the magic of my win at Leadville was, I just went into that race wanting to finish. And I didn't put all those expectations on myself or pressure, and I wasn't looking at the finish line. I mean, I wanted to finish, but I wasn't looking at the finish line in terms of any kind of goal beyond, making it 100 miles. And I think when we can let go and we free ourselves from the result and just be in the process of training, it was such a beautiful time, like leading up to Leadville, because I just was in my body and my spirit was strong and I felt good and I wasn't thinking about trying to win.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty special state. And again,
I think that's
not that our culture recognizes, we're all results oriented, goal oriented.
Right. But I think it's interesting you say you were in your body, and that is such a new term for me, because I've learned that through some trauma and, instances from our childhood or our past, we can just kind of exit our body and be a floating head, is what my friend Britt Frank calls it. And learning, especially if you've spent a life like with not being in your body, to learn to go out and exercise or connect and to feel and to step back into your body is an amazing feeling. So I like that you said that
it's
was
so empowering, right?
Yeah.
To be in touch with our inner power, and because we all have it. And I think for me, I really grew up in my body, but with a very overactive imagination. So I had both going on at the same time. And so I think that's why the ultra running is good, because at a certain point, the repetitive motion of your body takes over, and your all those busy thoughts in your brain just kind of subside. They don't go away forever, but it's a relief. But I'll say that to my children too, my daughters, when we go skiing, they love to ski, but I'm always like, ski in your body, be in your body, right? Like, so don't ski like trying to keep up with your friends, or don't ski, trying to show off for the instructor. Ski in your body. And they know what I mean by now, but sometimes I'll say that in front of their instructors and I'll get a kind of a funny look, but it's like, just be in your body. Like, your body knows. And when our egos get involved, that things get, complicated.
And that seems like such a smart safety thing to say too.
Yeah, in your body. Like, do not be a crazy maniac.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about body image. Have you always had a good body image, or was it never a thing because you just were tapped into what felt good? I mean, have you struggled with that?
That's a great question. I have not been asked that before. I think I've always had a pretty good body image because I have always been so physical, even as a child. Like, my body was like my tool. So it was what I used to do the things that made me feel good. And because I had some just uneasiness at home, and as I write about in Running Home, I was sort of split between two families, back and forth, which for a child, that's pretty unsettling. So I never really felt, my childhood was happy, and both my homes were happy homes, but by just bouncing back and forth some, it's this feeling of dislocation, of not really feeling at home in either. So I think my body became my home. And certainly my imagination, my storytelling was my home. And those two have always been very strong for me as kind of grounding me. Even now, if I'm feeling out of sorts, I'll go for a run, or sitting to write, and my notebook has the same effect a little bit. So I felt at home in my body, and it was really like how I moved, and how I moved was how I felt. And when I was moving, I could feel comfortable in myself. And so I didn't really struggle with body image, but I've had people try to tell me that that's my story. Right. So just going back to stories, like, or people assume that that's my story because I'm a runner, and I have a lighter build. So they want to put their stories on me, which is like, oh, you must be running to stay thin.
Yeah.
Or you must not be eating enough. And actually when I'm really training, I'm always having seconds of everything and ice cream and, but that's, the message I get is that I must be doing it for those body reasons. When really it's a much deeper, as I've mentioned, it's a creative process for me, running. And so I fortunately have not struggled with that, though I know that's very, it's prevalent among women. And I think partially like not competing in my teens, like at the high school or college level possibly helped me with that, because I know there's a lot of pressure on young women athletes to be a certain weight or size. And because I didn't compete and didn't have a coach, I've just sort of been like a little bit of an outlier. And I think that's been to my advantage.
Well, I just think it's funny because people want to project. Everyone wants to project body image one way or another, but you may not have had body image issues, but you thought you were dying of every disease on the internet for 18 months. Like, which is worse,
Right. Like, right. I mean, exactly.
The comparison of suffering is insane to me in this world. People that are overweight want to hate the thin ones, and the ones that this don't want this. But we're all at our core suffering on some level from something. And then at the end of the day, like if we can just be like, hey, you're a human too.
Right.
Nice to meet you,
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, if it's not this, it might be that. But right. I was thinking I was dying. And that was a form and I kind of explore this in the book a little bit of like, possibly self-abuse, right? Inflict that upon myself. Like I must have this. That sounds more like conscious, like I was in control of it. For a while I wasn't. Like I literally could just turn on the news and I would get that sinking feeling like, oh my God, I have that. But again, the running has helped me understand a little bit better, because when you run for long times alone, because I do most of my running alone, just logistically, but also because it is a creative state for me. You spend a lot of time, like you can watch your thoughts, and it becomes this sort of meditation in that when you do sitting meditation, which I do, and I have a practice. It's not very robust. I can't sit, I can sit, but I don't sit for more than like 10 minutes at a time, where I can run for hours and hours at a time. But, when you sit, the idea is not that you're going to empty your brain of thoughts. It's, I think that's a common misperception about meditation, that you're supposed to have no thoughts. The thoughts will come, but the idea is to see them come and let them pass. Right. And not get attached and not start telling stories about your thoughts and kind of get gripped by them. And so really that's what running does, because when I'm out there for 3 or 4 hours at a time, something might come up in my ankle or be like, oh, my ankle hurts. Maybe it's, maybe I'm about to, maybe my muscles are about to spasm and something bad's going to happen, or maybe not. So just like see that thought and let it just pass and come back to it. Like if the ankle keeps hurting, then I give myself permission to revisit it. But, it's really that idea of seeing the thought and then letting it pass and not getting hooked by it. Like it's so easy to get hooked by our thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think in that regard, running and meditating, or running and sitting, are pretty similar, because you can see your thoughts and practice letting them just float on by.
So what was your most memorable part of Leadville?
Oh gosh, I had so many parts. One of them that just right when you said that popped to mind was walking to the starting line with my husband, Steve, and my good friend, Susie, who had come to Leadville to crew for me. And the start was at 4 a.m. So this was probably 3:30 in the morning. And just walking to the starting line, it was pitch black and so many emotions and nerves, but mostly excitement. And kind of like crying a little bit with excitement and just gratitude for being there. I was overwhelmed with this feeling of gratitude, like everything that had preceded it. There were so many odds stacked against me. I had come back from this pretty serious broken leg and, surgery. And my doctor was like, I would never run again if I were you. And talk about a story that lived inside my head for a long time. And so just walking down, and I had this feeling of like, I can't believe I'm here at the start of my first 100-mile race and I'm healthy. Whatever happens is okay. whatever happens, I will learn something from it. And that's what running has taught me too, is that I know if I've done the work and put in that effort to get to the starting line, to do my practice, to run, that if I feel confident in that, then when I show up at a race, it's like I switch into a different mode. I just go into receive mode, right? So that I can let go and just receive what the day will bring. Because I have confidence in, that I've done all I can, and now it's just sort of up to what happens. And so I love that. It's very liberating because we get to shut down that part of us that thinks we can control everything. I certainly try to control my preparation and my training, but then kind of roll with what happens. And that was very much my state of mind. Walking to the starting line, I just got a little bit emotional, and I was overwhelmed that I had made it to the start, and I was ready for whatever would come. And I was open to it. And that was, that's a mindset or, sort of mental training or mindfulness that really came from, I think, from my meditation practice. And I think that was a really important, in hindsight, part of my training. Again, none of it was premeditated. I wasn't like, now I'm going to sit in order to train myself to win this race. Right. Just felt it felt like what I needed to do. And it really served me because my goal for Leadville was to just be in the flow as much as I could that day. And I expected I would pop out of it, right? You can't be in a flow state for 20 hours for all of a race. But I thought if I could be in the flow and feel the energy of the mountains and the other runners and tap into that, much more powerful than my own energy, that I would be able to be in that flow state. And I figured that the longer I could be in that, the better. And then eventually I might pop out, and then I would just sort of gut it out. And I believed in my own resilience that I would get through it. And so that was kind of my strategy. But, I didn't really pop out. I kind of stayed in that flow state all day. And much of it was to do with I had an amazing crew. My husband paced me for part of it. And, it was goofy and singing Men at Work songs with me. And we were having a blast. And then I would roll into aid stations, and my daughters would be there in costume because my friend Susie had brought costumes. And so it was this very celebratory feel, which is what I wanted it to feel like, because I knew it was really a celebration of the journey I'd been on, since I broke my leg, but preceding that, since I'd been in the deepest part of anxiety with my dad. And it was really like the icing on top.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I forget what I was going to ask you. I got lost on costumes. I was like, ooh, what costumes?
Disco. One of them was a disco. She had a sequin disco, and then the other had a whoopee cushion. Oh. I know. I was like, am I hallucinating? Because, you sort of can hallucinate when you run a little bit.
Whoopee cushion?
And they kept changing costumes, but I loved it. And the crowd was going crazy, both for me, because they were like, who is this person? But also for my children. They loved that energy. And
well, I think it's important to note that you finished first female, but you were 11th overall.
I know.
Out of all the people.
Yeah, more than 800.
And whoopee cushions, all of them.
I know. And it was pretty extraordinary. It was, everything converged that day. And it was really like the full expression of my life as a runner and as a writer and as a mother. And so all those things aligned, and I had this kind of just unlimited power. And I know it was magic. I obviously had done the work, but I think so much of it was I was so grateful. I felt this incredible humility for the mountains, and those now I understand are pieces for me, prerequisites to be in that flow state is, both preparation, like not just winging it, but doing the work, showing up, but feeling super grateful, humble, and also having a sense of humor. Those are big pieces for me, and that's what kids are good for, right?
Right. They force it. Right. You have to laugh or you'll just lay down and cry.
Exactly. You have two choices. You might as well laugh.
Yeah.
That's my husband is, really my secret weapon. That's a huge part of our marriage is that humor. And I think that is a big reason for my success, because, if you just take things too seriously, it's going to start to feel like work, and then it's going to be a grind. You're going to feel hurt, you'll get injured, and then, it's not a good scenario.
We have a joke in our house. Anytime I get anything new, one of the children will either have to have that thing, that exact thing that I have bought new, or they will take it and destroy it. And I'll go looking for something. I'm like, can I, do you have my thing? And they're like, no. And then it'll be under their bed, and it's this joke like that. I can't have anything that belongs to me anymore since I've had kids, because they just have to take it all. And I have to laugh because, otherwise it's like you're going to lose your mind.
Yes, you have to laugh. And that even like when I was in the sort of darkest, like despair over losing my father and having this new baby and the postpartum anxiety, my husband was always that sort of super low key comic relief. And, he comes across that way in the book. And that's really how he was. Like, I would think I was dying, and he would just give me this like little one-liner that like I couldn't help but laugh at. And so humor, I think, is really underrated. And just, as athletes, like we need to be able to laugh at in all of life, but specifically like for sports performance, it's like when you start to take yourself too seriously, that's a big, red flag.
Right. So this podcast is called The Same 24 Hours, meaning that we all have the same 24 hours, perhaps, to do Leadville in. But what we do in those 24 hours is what kind of makes our health, happiness, and success, on track, the greatest it can be. So I like to ask my guest, what is something that they do on a daily basis that they can kind of point to that makes the best of their 24 hours?
Wow. Okay. Just one thing?
Yeah.
I have a couple of things.
You can have two.
Running is usually part of my day, or I'll just be a little bit more generous and just say being in motion. So whether it's riding my bike or running, but in that fluid, creative state, like to move my body is so important. That just jumpstarts everything else. It jumpstarts my imagination. It makes me a more empathetic, patient mother. I think that a day without being in motion is not a great day for me. And then the other piece is more of sitting. And so it's either writing in my notebook. I just keep daily notebooks. I guess some people call them journals or diaries, but I just call them notebooks. And a good day for me involves either sitting and writing in my notebook for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, or doing sitting meditation, again, for like 8 or 10 minutes. And often those two things go hand in hand. I do a little sitting, and then I do a little writing, and then I'll do a run. And that's kind of a really good recipe for both a creative day, but also a very grounded day, and just a better day as a mother. And
it's so true. You keep coming back to as a mother, but it's so true. Like, I come back to my children much better. It takes off that edge where you want to just kind of fly off the handle.
Right.
That goes away. When they've asked the same question 50 times in a row and you've answered it 51, you can answer it one more time without losing
exactly
it.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right. So being in motion and sitting and then writing, I think are my kind of the secret recipe for success.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. Her book Running Home is available everywhere. And I guess one more question is what is next? Do you have any other plans?
Yes.
Competitiveness?
Yes, I am doing some bigger races later this summer. The plan is to go over to Europe and race CCC, which is part of the Ultra Tour de Mont Blanc series, and it's 62 miles in the Alps. And then I've got some bigger races coming up. I'm kind of just coming off a really busy spring of book touring and racing, which I guess I decided to do both at the same time. So I've got some races, and I'm starting to work on next book ideas, and I want to write fiction, and so it's good. It's when my running is flowing, my writing usually is, and vice versa. It's a nice feedback loop.
Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to seeing how you do in the Alps. That sounds
Great.
exciting.
Thanks so much for your
All
time.
right. Take
This
care,
was the
Katie.
best. Okay. Bye.